Okay, everyone, it is now officially 1:01. Uh, Again, my name is Eric Rodell. I'm our Business and Political Engagement Manager here at People for Bikes. I'm joined by Morgan Lomely, our Director of State and Local Policy, and Noah Banayan, our Federal Policy Manager in Washington, D.C. We're going to be talking about the new DOI ruling about e-bikes on federal public lands and what kind of opportunities we have to get more Americans riding bikes on our public lands today. So I'm going to shoot things over to Noah in DC, and she'll get things started for us.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I'm Noah. I'm here in DC with People for Bikes, and I'm excited to be talking to you all about e-bikes and this new policy that is the first step in what will likely be a long process towards expanding access for e-bikes on our public lands. So here's a quick agenda. We'll go over the policy itself, what happened with the announcement straight from the Department of Interior, and then Morgan will talk to you all about what this policy means going forward and how to get involved in the public process. Great. So just for some background, e-bikes are not regulated by access necessarily at the federal level, only at the consumer product safety level, the manufacturing level, and when it comes to federal funding for projects where sometimes e-bikes are eligible. States are responsible for regulating the use of e-bikes on streets and bike paths and multi-use paths presently. And local, state, and federal agencies are the ones that get to decide where e-bikes are allowed at the state level, at the local level, and then specifically for e-mountain bikes and trail access on state lands and other entities outside public lands, federal public lands. This announcement from the Department of Interior will add another level to how e-bikes are regulated at the federal level, mainly by adding some clarity on where they are allowed and where we can start building on access. So for the specific policy, so the Department of Interior released their framework for policy on August 30th, so pretty recently. This creates a framework to their land management agencies on how to regulate e-bikes on department lands. Presently, they're defined as motor vehicles, or up until this announcement, they were defined as motor vehicles and therefore not allowed where motor vehicles are not allowed, instead of treating them like bicycles. And so what we can expect with this framework is for these land management agencies to take the charge and create their policies for how e-bikes to be defined like regular bikes and not like motorized vehicles can access their trails and their paths and their bike lanes and other types of infrastructure on our public lands. On August 30th, so there were two announcements. It was the Department of Interior's order, the Secretarial Order number 3376 to get wonky, and then the National Park Service was the first agency within the department to also release their policy, and that's 1901. So, like I said, this order directs each of the land management agencies within the department to create policies that will expand e-bike access. Firstly, by offering a federal definition as it pertains to public lands, by offering class distinctions, which we'll get into in a second. But just so we're all aware, these agencies include the four listed here: the Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation. This does not apply to wilderness areas, and it does not apply to Forest Service because that's under the Department of Agriculture. So that would be a different process. And to be very clear, as it's listed here, this did not open up public lands as of August 30th. It started a process. It offered a framework for these agencies to build their own processes and offer land managers the independence that they need to look at their lands, to talk to their local communities, to figure out their rider patterns and decide how and where e-bikes are appropriate and will naturally sort of flow with their use patterns. The goals of this policy are to allow the appropriate classes of e-bikes. What we consider a big win in this policy is that the federal government now recognizes the 3 classes of e-bikes, class 1, 2, and 3, that the industry has, obviously recognized for a while now, and we worked hard to create these distinguishing factors between e-bikes. And now those same exact classes are included in this policy as a method for land managers to discern access. So they can say, well, on this trail, class 1 might be more appropriate than class 3, or on this multi-use path, we could see all classes of e-bikes allowed. To be clear, this policy does not allow for e-bikes to be used anywhere where bikes are already restricted. So those restrictions still apply to e-bikes as they do to conventional bikes. And this is only going to expand access where bikes are already allowed in national parks and our public lands. So like I said, this is the first step that the Department of Interior is taking and what will be a longer process. This first announcement offered a 30-day time frame for these land management agencies. So with the first deadline being September 12th, which is passed, for these land management agencies to develop an interim policy to govern e-bike use as the process continues for them to get a public rule sort of finalized. They haven't released those publicly, their interim policies, quite yet. They're using them to build until the September 28th deadline, where they'll announce, each agency will announce a formal rulemaking process that People for Bikes will be tracking, and we will be alerting the industry on when there are opportunities for public comment. And this will be when land managers and superintendents and other area managers for our public land units are able to solicit comments on their specific units of land, their specific individual trails in their parcels, to discern from the public where e-bikes make sense and where they're wanted, and where maybe some restrictions can apply.
Great, thanks, Noah. This is Morgan Lomley. I am the state and local policy director here at People for Bikes, and if you have been involved in e-bikes with People for Bikes for the past couple of years, hopefully we've met before. But thanks, Noah, for that wonderful overview of what can be kind of a technical and wonky policy update. But just trying to put it into perspective, as Noah said, e-bikes were considered motorized vehicles by the Department of Interior, which manages those 4 agencies for forever, essentially. And so this is a first step in what we believe to be, like Noah said, a long process to, create some more consistent guidelines for e-bikes that are consistent with where people who ride an e-bike want to ride, e-bike technology, and just a lot of these agencies' desires to get more people recreating on our public lands. So we'll go through a couple of the talking points and really great ways to describe this to stakeholders and a lot of our partners. But first I wanted to go into the National Park Service Policy Directive. So at the higher level, the Secretary of the Interior did direct those 4 agencies that are underneath the Interior to update their e-bike policies. And for a little bit more context, the Department of Interior has 9 agencies under its umbrella, including the U.S. Geological Survey, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but the 4 that Noah outlined, National Park Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Those are really the 4 under the Department of Interior that manage lands in part or wholly for recreation and conservation and preservation. So those are the ones that have mountain biking and biking opportunities. So what the secretarial order did, as Noah said, was it said e-bikes should be defined as bikes, and all 4 agencies, you are now responsible for updating your e-bike policies within your agency. And in tandem with that secretarial order that actually came out on August 29th, the National Park Service released its updated e-bike policy. So it was the first of those 4 agencies to release its policy. And what that policy said was e-bikes will be permitted to ride in areas where bicycles may be ridden on National Park Service lands. So just to give you some context, I would say that of all the National Park Service units, I think there are about 120, give or take a few. Fewer than half do allow mountain biking on dirt trails. A lot of those parks allow biking on the roads or on either paved or unpaved bike paths that are flatter, not that much grade, more of a recreational kind of family type biking experience. And then there are a few national park units that allow single track experiences, and not to say that those aren't family experiences, but more of your mountain biking single track type experience. A few off the top of my mind are like Big South Fork National River and Recreational Area in Tennessee, Crater Lake National Park, Everglades National Park, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, Lake Mead in Nevada, New River Gorge National River in West Virginia. There are a lot of kind of dirt type trail experiences for bicycles in these national parks, even though national parks aren't really known for having a wide breadth of mountain bike trail opportunities. But there are opportunities to get more people riding e-bikes in these parks. So the 2 other things that the National Park Service e-bike policy memorandum does are they do allow superintendents, and these are the people, men and women in charge of each national park. They do allow those superintendents to limit or restrict, for public health and safety, natural and cultural resource protection, and other management activities and objectives. They can restrict e-bike access where bikes are allowed. They have to do this by notifying the public, but in general, all the new e-bike policy and all those restrictions need to be in the park compendium, which is the management document for each park. And each of the parks needs to update their compendium within 30 days. So there's a huge opportunity for engagement with those parks now within the next 30 days and just beyond, as well as they seek to implement the secretarial order and allow e-bikes where bikes are allowed. So what can you do? So if I had to guess, the majority of people on our call today are suppliers and dealers and retailers and components suppliers and people in the bike industry making and selling bikes and bike parts and really trying to get more people riding e-bikes. So you are connected to e-bike riders, but you also have their own voice in reaching out to the people who manage our public lands. But you as an industry member and as a business, for example, would have a voice in reaching out to those agencies and letting them know that, number one, you support the secretarial order and the NPS policy memo. Number 2, you have a growing user base of people who want to ride e-bikes, and this will help you meet the needs of that user base. And number 3, that you want to be a resource to these park managers as they develop their policy. So what can you do? So first of all, figure out what lands are managed in your area by the Bureau of Land Management, Reclamation, Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife. And in some respects, it's kind of easy. You can look at a map, but in other respects, it's hard to figure out where public land boundaries start and end and things like that. So use People for Bikes as a resource. We're always happy to poke around and help find those. The priority areas, I'd say, are close to urban areas. There are a lot of public lands close to urban areas where e-bikes are not currently allowed, and we want to change that, obviously, because they're closer to big population centers. So think about that as your first filter, and obviously what's close to you is important too. Call or email that land manager. These are our public officials. These are people whose job it is to manage the resources and also manage the public's desire to use the resources. So they are receptive to offers of help, offers of e-bike demos, willingness to hear your story and just understand the technical and innovative aspects of e-bikes. So use your voice as someone who knows a lot about e-bikes, maybe rides e-bikes, knows about the customers and demographics and technology and innovation around e-bikes, to offer that as a resource to these land managers. And I can't emphasize enough that we can't assume that these land managers know a lot about e-bikes. Many do. Many have heard of the bike industry, obviously, and people for bikes and are aware of our resources, but a lot of them have probably never been on an e-bike, don't understand who rides an e-bikes, but certainly want to understand the demographics, and just haven't been exposed to it yet until they heard about this secretarial order, and their job is to update e-bike policies. So you're the technical experts, you know a lot about all the depth and breadth of the e-bike industry. So use that in contacting your land managers and advocating for better access. So some talking points, and a lot of these are pulled from the secretarial order and the National Park Service policy memo. So it's actually really impressive to read both of those documents to see how e-bikes are positioned. They're not just bikes as usual. These are, as we all know, they're bikes with a boost, and they're bikes that get new people using our public lands, which our public land agencies want to see. So I would encourage everyone to go and read the resources at peopleforbikes.org/ebikes. We link to our FAQs and the different documents we're referring to here. But just to provide you a really quick overview, e-bikes provide more Americans with opportunities to recreate. They do solve a lot of the challenges that we face that are beyond recreation. So traffic congestion, parking issues, maintenance backlogs for trails, and emissions reductions. Talk about the kind of people who like to ride e-bikes. It's not just a traditional mountain biker or someone who has 12 other bikes in their garage. They're people who certainly can't bike anymore because of any particular challenge. Think about land managers' goals. They want to get people recreating in places that don't see a ton of recreation, but that can sustain that recreation. And what I'm kind of referring to is a lot of Americans see our parks and our public lands just through their car window. But there are a lot of areas that are further away from trailheads, but perfectly fit for increased visitation. So e-bikes can accomplish that as well. So they help the land managers disperse the bike use and the public use of the parks, and also just broaden the different areas that people can visit by bike. A couple more talking points here. I mentioned these a little bit, but land managers especially are looking for new ways to connect with the people who visit their parks, and e-bikes help them do that. So they don't have to use a truck or a car to visit places in the park and just manage the customer service part of their job. And they also don't have to do everything by bike, which, as we all know, can take a little bit longer. So e-bikes help them get to different places to check in on the public resources, check in on trailheads and signs, and visit with their visitors without the use of a bike or having to do it by foot or with a car. So we have heard countless stories of land managers using e-bikes for patrolling, maintenance, and visitor services that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do with other means. And as we all hopefully know, in terms of the environmental impacts, if you're working on this, you'll probably get asked about this a lot. Small studies show that e-bikes or Class 1 e-bikes and traditional bikes have very similar impacts, and similar impacts to foot travel as well. So a lot of the big questions we'll face are on social impacts. What happens to other folks' trail experiences if an e-bike is added to the mix? What does happen to visitation numbers and the carrying capacity of the trail? We don't have all the answers to that as well. It's a good conversation starter, and offering demos is a good way to figure out who might be using e-bikes, and who and what those trail experiences might be. But use a lot of the resources that we have on our resource library to answer those questions, and talk about how we're kind of moving past the natural resource argument against e-bikes and more towards the social questions we have out there. I mentioned resources, so I'm very proud of our peopleforbikes.org/ebikes website. We have research and statistics. We have state-by-state handouts for what the e-bike law is in every state. We have a lot of resources for land managers, our land manager handbook. And on that kind of homepage of the e-bike website, we do have links to our FAQs, which explain this in great but simple detail. And we also have the links to the secretarial order and the policy memorandum. So use People for Bikes as a resource. Go online and check out our e-bike kind of resource library. Eric has that linked. When we send out the webinar link, you'll be able to see these handouts that we have in the bottom right-hand page, and then always be in touch with any questions you have if you're curious what a policy means, or how you can be involved locally, or need help finding a local park or a land manager contact information. It's really our charge to help get more people riding bikes more often, and that includes e-bikes as well. So use this as a resource. And we've left at least 10 minutes for questions, and this is my favorite part, to just kind of get the pulse of the community and see what we weren't able to answer and what's on your mind. So give us a shot at some questions here, and we will try to answer them. So first question from Christopher Dowis here. The DOI order allowing all e-bikes up to 28 miles an hour conflicts with federal highway definitions in certain aspects of federal code. So, and especially for the e-bike definition within the authorizing statute for recreational trails program. So how can these conflicts be resolved? So what Christopher here is asking is an excellent question. It's, if you're using federal funds for the purpose of bike facilities, e-bikes aren't always allowed on those facilities, especially if you're using recreational trails program grant money. We recognize that that's a huge inconsistency, and it's something that we seek to resolve, and maybe even within the surface transportation reauthorization process that's coming up in 2020. So this isn't the end all of federal policy around e-bikes. It's the first step with a major land management agency to update those definitions consistent with the 3 classes, and we seek to do that in some of the authorizing language for different federal funds for bike facilities. Next question here, Kurt asks, what is the anticipated state level adoption given the precedent being set at the national levels? So 22 states have adopted the 3-class system, and the states within their vehicle and traffic code. So those states and their traffic laws define the 3 classes for the purpose of riding an e-bike on the road, on the bike path, kind of your more paved or curb-to-curb facilities. Where e-bikes can go on natural soft surface unimproved trails like single track mountain bike trails is up to a local or state public lands group, for example, Colorado State Parks or Colorado Parks and Wildlife, or whatever your respective state public lands group is. So I think only 3 or 4 states have adopted the classes within their regulations. Colorado is one, Wyoming, Texas, I believe. The question, I think, really gets to the point that the National Park Service memo and the secretarial order are examples of updating public lands regulations consistent with the 3 classes. And I would imagine that all state agencies are kind of looking at what the Park Service and the DOI are doing and either hope to follow suit or use that as an example to craft their own legislation. So it's kind of chicken and the egg. One agency kind of needs to put their head out and start the updates, and then a lot of agencies will follow suit and use that as examples. So I think this is just the beginning. Next question from Pete. Is there any news about the Forest Service opening up select trails to EMTBs? So I think that my answer would be pretty similar. The Forest Service has not updated their regulations. I've heard here and there that they're probably considering a new rulemaking to update their definition of an e-bike, but that is rumor at this point. Because the Park Service has started this, I would imagine that the Forest Service will follow suit, but the timeline and the details are 100% to be determined. Cool. Next question is from Boone. From what I'm hearing, National Forest Land has adopted verbiage and legislation to allow e-bikes of certain categories. I have not heard this, and so far I don't believe this to be accurate. Either through legislation or regulation, I haven't seen anything come out of the U.S. Forest Service. So there are a couple Forest Service areas, such as the Tahoe National Forest, the San Juan, the Inyo. Those are all out west in Colorado and California, that to various degrees are allowing Class 1 and or 2 e-bikes where bikes are allowed. And those are specific to those Forest Service areas, but there's no DC level rulemaking to update e-bike regulations right now. So next question from Craig. Seems to be a question about lumping Class 2 and 3 e-bikes into the more mountain bike style Class 1s. So it's really, the question here is lumping all the classes together. The benefit of the class system is and Noah mentioned this as well, it allows a level of distinction between the classes and where you want them to be allowed. And in other words, yes, e-bikes of all classes should be allowed per the NPS policy memo where bikes are allowed, but I would really imagine that superintendents will go in and decide what top assisted speed and what kind of enabling mechanism, throttle or pedal assist, is appropriate for what facilities. The industry in general, we, People for Bikes, definitely advocates for class 1, 2, and 3 e-bikes to be allowed anywhere bikes are allowed for the road and for the most part for bike paths as well. And we have this kind of loose agreement that class 1 EMTBs are what we mean when we describe EMTBs suited for single track trails. And most of the product out there designed for single track trail experiences is class 1 with a few exceptions. So I would imagine that the Bureau of Land Management, which is the big player here in terms of single track mountain bike experiences, will end up distinguishing class 1, 2, and 3 for the purpose of single track. But obviously we are working on the outside here and don't know how that'll fall, but I think that the land managers will take advantage of the class system and not lump them all in together. Next question from Paul. What are the implications of the DOI policy on allowing for local trail organizations to have a say in that policy? So does the federal policy offer enough leeway for local agencies to make decisions for e-bikes? Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. So it certainly does. And each of these agencies needs to have public involvement around what their new policies are. So the local trail groups will definitely have a say as stakeholders. And then the local trail or the local kind of land managers that manage trails will also have that say, and through the traditional public involvement channels. But I know you're from Southern California, Paul, and it does allow for a little bit more leeway for consistency between, for example, Orange County Parks and the Santa Monica National Recreation Area and other Park Service units that are out there, and state parks especially. So I think that once the Park Service units do update their e-bike policies within the compendium, the local and state agencies that might be neighboring tracts of land will follow suit or will decide on consistency between all the different landholders. Question from Jack. Hi, Jack. So it sounds like from your interpretation, agencies will be able to designate routes by classes. I could be wrong, but our interpretation is yes, they'll be able to designate routes by classes, and that's the beauty of the class system in the secretarial order. I could really be wrong. I obviously work at People for Bikes here and not any Department of Interior agency, but I believe that updating e-bike policies so that e-bikes of any class are allowed generally where bikes are allowed is what the directive or what the secretarial order seeks to accomplish, and then how you distinguish that based on the local facilities is up to the agencies.
And it seems like that's it for questions around this. Thank you very much for being involved with the webinar today and interacting with us. I want to take a brief second to thank all of our coalition members here at People for Bikes. We couldn't provide these great tools for industry members, land managers, and anybody interested in bikes without the support of our members. So if you're interested in becoming a member of People for Bikes, please do contact me at ericb@peopleforbikes.org.
And one last thing here. So you heard from me, Morgan. My email is right here. You also heard from Noah Banian, and her email is noah@peopleforbikes.org. And Noah manages all of our DC and federal affairs, and especially around e-bikes too. So feel free to always contact me or Noah with any questions or news or anything that we can be a resource to. Thank you for your time.